Hey, hello, everybody. It's Jay Binkowitz here, and I am joined by one of my very good friends, Dr. Mick Kling. Many of you know Mick's affiliation as a practice management and transition advisor over at Vision Source. He also has a consulting company called Impact Leadership. I've spoken and shared courses with Mick many times because he's the P&L guru. I consider him a dear friend and one of the most well-versed folks in the industry to talk about the topics we're talking about today, or the topic we're talking about today, which is about the attitude it takes to obtain profitability. Really thinking about it, we're not talking about a P&L per se today, and we're not talking about how much money did you make on the frame, or what does it cost you to run your business. Today, we're really talking about the emotional and psychological disposition necessary that drives the behaviors in order to create profitability. And so, I'm going to jump over to Mick here, who I know has been on every side of the fence on this one. Welcome, Mick.
Hi, Jay. Thanks so much for having me to talk about one of our favorite topics, profitability. But I love the slant today about sort of the emotional side of it and the mindset that's needed for profitability. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, absolutely. I know, throughout my own career, even going back to when I was running my practice with Dr. Mark Stadlin in Astoria, Queens, I was obsessed with, learning what makes us money, what doesn't make us money, what systems and procedures do we need? How do we reduce the number of steps in order to deliver something more expeditiously? How do we bring in more patients? I mean, this is like an ongoing list that I think anybody in the industry has thought the same things. But as we're talking about trying to uncover and understand how to run our businesses, it's the drive, it's that obsession to learn it, to understand it, to talk to people about it, to gather information from others on how they're doing it. It's that motivation to go that far that actually creates the success, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is really important in and around this topic is really defining what we're talking about when we talk about profit. Because when I have a consulting call with a practice that's got profitability questions or concerns, the very first thing is I want to define, like, what are we talking about? What type of profit do you mean? And what I mean by that is our accountant's opinion and perspective of profitability is not necessarily what we as business owners think about profitability. See, our accountants think of a profit and loss statement, which is money comes in the practice and expenses go out, and what's left at the bottom is called profit. That's primarily measured so we can determine our tax liability. But that's not exactly what we're looking for as business owners in the form of profitability, because it's possible to have profit on a profit and loss statement, but actually have expenses that are greater than the money coming in. And so it's important to understand that profit on a P&L does not mean that you're actually making money.
That's so funny. How many times have you heard folks say, I don't understand, I'm paying taxes on this profit, but I have no money in the
Yeah,
bank. And that's so much of that. Versus there are folks that really don't show a lot of profit on their P&Ls and they're flush with cash.
that's right. That's
And
right.
it's understanding, how does that happen?
Yeah, and the two big things that happen in a practice that cause that scenario which you described, which is I've got profit on a profit and loss statement. I now have a call from my CPA telling me I owe taxes, but I pull out my phone and there's no money in the bank account, happens primarily because we don't consider the principal payments on the debt that we make out of the practice. For instance, if I borrow money to buy an OCT, and I'm making a monthly payment, let's say it's $1,000 a month, a portion of that is interest and a portion of that is principal. Well, the interest is deductible. The IRS says we can charge that as an expense against our business, but the principal portion doesn't show up on our profit and loss statement. It's actually taken out of the profit of our business. So it's actually cash coming out of the business, but yet it's still taxable income. The second big one is the draw that we take as an owner out of the business, because sometimes we use our practice as an ATM machine and we pull money for personal expenses whenever we need it. Those are distributions, which is also profit from the business, but yet it's almost like an expense to the business because you're pulling cash out of the business. So those two things are not reflected on the P&L.
I totally agree. Thinking about so many of the doctors that you and I have worked with, and I don't know where that number would be. It's certainly a 4-digit number now that that you and I, a number of doctors we've talked with. The expression, someone makes money despite themselves has come across the table many times. But practices are so busy that the fact that they're not doing everything right doesn't matter. They're still making money, right? So they're just leaving a lot of money on the table, but they're still making money. But then we always meet those folks who are extraordinary, that know the nuances of their business. They understand how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. They're driven in order to keep that in the loop. They don't just completely say someone else takes care of that. I don't know how that works. And and they build amazing practices. And amazing practice doesn't necessarily have to be a $5 million practice. It could be an amazing $1.5 million practice that sometimes could make more than a $2.5 million practice because they're driven for profit, right? They're driven to understand their business. So I was just thinking in my own mind of the habits and the, like we said, the emotions and the drive of those folks really making the difference, because we're all in the same business, and yet those folks make a lot more money. So what are some of the characteristics of those folks that you've met that kind of fill that in?
Yeah, most optometrists, and I would even say optician owners, really have very little business acumen training. So most of us really are ill prepared to really understand the finances of our business to begin with. So we have that big disadvantage to start with. Some owners, I find, are very much willing to learn and engage, and some really get to the point where they almost like bury their head in the sand and they don't want to even bother with that because they're so intimidated by the financial piece. The ones that are willing to go out on a limb and learn new concepts, financial concepts that maybe are outside of their comfort zone, are the ones that I find are most successful. One of the most interesting things that I do on a weekly basis in my role with Vision Source is I look at the profit and loss statements of our members. And it's remarkable, Jay, how you can have two $1 million revenue generating practices and just subtle little differences between how their spend is occurring in the practice makes a huge impact on their bottom line. And as you and I talk a lot about this concept of EBITDA, how it impacts the EBITDA. So a practice could have costs of goods, for instance, that are just slightly higher than national averages, or maybe their staff costs are slightly too high, or maybe their occupancy costs are slightly too high. All of that changes the dynamics of the profitability of the business dramatically. So 1% of overspending makes a huge difference. So the practices that are really understanding where every dollar goes do so much better than the ones that are just head down, grinding, trying to see patients.
Right, but that's coming from somebody who wants to know that, right? So, I think the contribution of peer groups, there's lots of private groups where folks get together and share their numbers, the great game of business, all those kind of things, anything that brings awareness to the numbers, right? Those doctors that really go about, you've got a whiteboard behind you. When I walk into an office and see a whiteboard full of numbers, I feel good already, because that means that everybody wants to know what's going on. I think those doctors that get involved, I'm not even going to say doctors, those business owners that get involved and want to know the numbers and want to know how things work, and then reach out to their peers to find out how they're doing it. Those are the traits of the folks that really become extraordinarily successful, and quite frankly, come up with some fantastic solutions, because we know we live on an ocean that keeps moving, and so we'll always have to come up with something new. One of one of the consistencies that I've seen across the board for folks that really have accomplished that profit success are those who are involved, whether it's alliance groups, peer groups, they're involved in a peer group model somehow that allows them to learn from others, even if the other businesses are not exactly the same. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, 100%. Practices that align themselves with peers tend to outperform those that are trying to make a go of it independently. No question about that. And I think the other thing too that sort of I was thinking about as you were saying that, Jay, is one of the things that a lot of practices don't have is structure, financial structure, don't have a plan. And as I've mentioned to you before, one of my favorite practice management strategies or cash flow management strategies is this concept called Profit First, which is based off of a book written by a business author named Mike Mick. And basically, it's in its most simplest form, it's just basically a pay yourself first concept. So what you do is you decide to be profitable on every dollar that you collect in the practice. For instance, you're taking profitability off the table first, and then you're learning to run your business on what's left. And because there's less available to run our business, it changes our behavior. It changes the way we decide how to use money. It causes us to become more frugal, more innovative. So it just changes the way that we run the business. And if that sounds like a crazy idea, think for a minute what the IRS does. They have a concept called taxes first, right? Because when we get paid a paycheck, a W-2 paycheck, the government figured out if we don't take our taxes out first, we'll never get the money at the end of the year because we as humans, we consume everything that's available to us generally. And so when you take profitability off the table first, you are forced to live within the means of running your practice on what's left. And so that little mental shift of profit needs to come first before expenses, to me, is one of the biggest game changers. Because otherwise, we pay all the bills and we hope there's profitability at the end of the month, but we're doing it in the wrong order.
It's very interesting and it's very true. You need to have the balance, right? And looking at both sides of that coin is years ago, when I joined Dr. Stadlin, I came up with the phrase, the Monday morning number. And it was a lesson that I had learned when I was a very young man and opened up my first business. And the fact that I said a very young man, it was a long time ago. But I had walked into a bank. I was a teenager opening up a bank account for a new business. And the banker was quite interested in how this young man was coming in to do this. And he said to me, "Hey, do you know how much it's going to cost you to open your business?" And back then I said, "Yeah, I know how much we're spending." And he goes, "No, do you know how much it's going to cost you?" And so I was okay, I'm about to learn a lesson here. And he really said to me, "Do you know what it's going to cost you to run your business?" is what he was trying to get to. And the answer is, I didn't have a clue. I only knew how much I was spending to open the door. But I had no idea really. I mean, I knew what my rent was going to be and, that kind of stuff, but I really didn't understand, how much revenue do I have to generate at what gross profit margin in order to pay these bills? Mm-hmm. I didn't know those numbers. And it kind of led to me creating a phrase called the Monday morning number, which is basically saying, hey, every Monday morning you put your key in the door, you write a check. And you need to know what that check is for the week. So if a patient doesn't show up that week, you still have to write the check. You still got bills to pay. So how much is that number? And then based on your gross profit margin, what you want to do is generate enough revenue in the first 3 days by Wednesday, based on your growth, in order to pay off the check you wrote on Monday. And then for me, Thursday and Friday is my profit. It was kind of like a funny way of kind of looking at it, but it was really saying, I need to understand what it's costing me to open the door.
Yeah.
I have almost never met anybody who knows that number. And to me, it's such a significant number. And I believe that those doctors who are driven to profit do know that number. They do understand what it costs them to run their business. They do understand how the pieces fall together. Don't you?
I do. And what you're alluding to is this difference between what we call fixed costs and variable costs. So the fixed costs are all the things that if not one single patient shows up, we still have to write that Monday morning check for, right? So rent, staff, paper clips, paper,
Utilities.
insurance, utilities, all that stuff, right? That's a check that has to be written every Monday morning. And then the variable costs are our frames, lenses, contact lenses that occur. So I think that scaling that fixed cost wall is the biggest challenge. And the concept that I think a lot of business owners don't really understand is how much revenue do I need to generate just to get over that wall? Because if I can't get over that wall, I'm never going to see profitability in my business.
It's huge. And I would say to folks that open up new practices, I still get phone calls, and I'll say to them, how much cash do you have put aside for the first 18 months after you open the door? I'm going to tell you, most of the time, it's close to zero or some kind of insignificant number. And I'm like, so do you really think you're going to be profitable on day one? I mean, that after you see the first patient, you're going to be able to pay all your bills? You know, how are you going to live? How are you going to take care of your family? How are you going to eat? How are you going to put gas in your car? I said, you know, it takes time to build a practice. Now, God willing, in a year, you're where you need to be at least break even. And that would be a wonderful thing, quite frankly. But, you know, have you backed yourself up so that you don't have the pressure of then going further into debt later, hoping that you're going to make profit.
Yeah.
And that's another like part of that attitude. Those who walk into business and say, hopefully, you know, I'm going to just pay myself X dollars as soon as I open my practice without actually understanding that they may not make money for 18 months. That's when we see, and it's sad, that's when we see folks get into a lot of trouble because their entire approach to opening up the door, they didn't have that attitude.
Yeah, you know, and I work with a fair number of cold starts in the Vision Source ecosystem. We have a lot of cold starts that join our organization, and so I'll frequently get a call. They'll be about 8, 10, 12 months into their ownership, and they're struggling because of what you said. They didn't put enough working capital back, or they thought they would be profitable more quickly. And I always go back to the beginning, which is what you said, which is I pull up the whiteboard and I say, let's do some math and figure out how much revenue you need to generate just to break even. Once we've gotten that number, then we can sort of get granular and decide, well, how many exams is that per day? And then it allows them to anchor on a number, because the reality is you really shouldn't be pulling any money out of the business for yourself until you've exceeded that hurdle. But they don't even often know what that number is. And so
Right.
Understanding where that target is and where they need to be shooting for and getting really granular and saying, well, how many eye exams do I have to do to hit that number? Then they can go back to their team and say, okay, our goal is 3 exams a day or 5 exams a day, whatever that number is. But again, that's structure, right? It's creating a plan. It's making sure that we're thoughtful about what it is that we need to do to be successful.
It's huge, and thoughtful is I guess the right word. It's not assuming. Listen, someone can go get a job in any entity today and be guaranteed income. There's no question about that. But as soon as you step into ownership or set up a new practice or purchase a practice, all the guarantees are out the window.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't have that mindset to really understand your business, doesn't matter what business you're in, quite frankly. I mean, it's not just optometry. If you don't have the mindset to know the ins and outs of the business, then you've allowed fate to decide whether or not you're going to make a living.
Yeah, Jay, this is so important because our business finances are so intertwined with our personal, not only finances, but everything about us, our stresses at home and with our personal life. Everything is so intertwined. When your business finances are not in order, I see a lot of the rest of our lives get extremely disrupted. And so this is not just a topic that we're saying you should think about getting your business life in order. You really need to, because if you don't, it's going to have a negative impact on every other aspect of your life. And so I think that's the message that I want to get out to members, get out to colleagues, is that owning a practice involves risk, but it's also opportunity. And we don't want you to get resentful against your business because you're stressed out, you're overwhelmed, you're worried about money, and you're thinking, why don't I just go get a job and be an employee of somebody because this isn't worth the heartache. It doesn't have to be that way. We
Right.
owners should be rewarded for that extra effort.
100%. Listen, not everybody is meant to be an owner. It's not the mindset of everybody, and that's okay. There's
Right.
plenty of great opportunities in this industry. There's unbelievable opportunities in this industry for optometrists. It doesn't mean you have to be an owner. If the definition of success is being an owner, but you don't make any money, I don't know. I don't know how you achieve success. But to that degree, I think the word owners should own it is kind of like the way I look at it. That's like my attitude about it. It's my business. I need to own it. I need to own it for the good, and I need to own it for the bad, and I need to get my hands dirty, and I need to not turn a blind eye to stuff and not just say, hey, that person takes care of it, and so I don't have to worry about it. It's great to have fantastic people that are that competent and that well-trained, but I still want to know what's going on and make sure that we understand what's happening and making the best decisions, developing the best relationships. So for me, owners should own it is kind of like my attitude.
Yeah, and that circles right back to this whole mindset conversation that we started with, which is that's the mindset that's required in order to be a successful owner. We can't just be on autopilot. We have to be willing to make investments in understanding our businesses and constantly growing and learning new concepts. Those are the practices that I see most successful.
Yeah, I totally agree. Hey, Mick, this was a great talk. I know we're going to have a bunch more talks because you and I never stop talking, which is great. We always love to bring up different types of topics. I'm looking forward to doing more topics with GPN's visions, and plus what you and I do at Expo. We've got Expo coming up, so you and I get to throw the football back and forth a little bit like we love to. And we're going to keep rocking and rolling and hopefully open up some eyes and ears to what we're talking about.
I agree. Thank you, Jay, for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mick.